Yo, so today we're going to be breaking down a super layered ambient melody for someone like Drake and then throwing some drums on it at the end. Alright, so for the first sound in the melody, I went into Analog Labs and grabbed an atmosphere preset called Blue Note. Overall, these atmosphere presets just kind of behave like a super unique pad, so they're really fun to use. Alright, and then here's the MIDI for this, and I went ahead and played the majority of this out on the MIDI keyboard, so I can't really remake it from scratch. But if I go ahead and put it back down into D sharp minor, you can see that I just started off with a normal triad and then went into a 7th chord. So if I go ahead and move this C sharp down an octave, you can see that we have the normal triad, and then we added the G sharp on top to make it a 7th chord. And then finally inverting that C sharp just to change up the voicing and overall make it a little bit more interesting. And then for this 3rd chord, I went ahead and used the same process. So if we move this B down, you can see normal triad, add the F sharp on top to make it a 7th, and then invert the B. And then for this last chord, it's a little bit different. So I went ahead and grabbed the A sharp and the F from the 2nd chord, moved it over, and then duplicated it up an octave just to make it seem really full, and overall it's a really dark sounding chord. For these melodies, I really like to switch between an empty sounding chord like a triad and then move into a super full sounding chord like a 7th or a 9th chord, and switch between them to kind of get a mix of a dark and emotional feeling. And that's really what you're going for in these kind of melodies, and that's how you get the sound you get switching between the chords. So after I had these chords figured out, I went ahead and duplicated the root notes down 3 octaves and then added in these little bass note chops. And then for this A sharp, I actually have it offset forward from the start of the chord, so it gives an interesting effect where the bass note hits before the actual chord hits. So after that, I went ahead and added in a bunch of accent notes, and all of them are using the notes next to each other in the scale. So since we're in D sharp minor, the notes next to each other in the scale would be F, F sharp, A sharp, and B. And when you use these notes all together, they give a really dark feeling, which is perfect for these kind of melodies. So like I just mentioned, if we look at all of the accent or counter melody pieces, you can see that they're all using the notes that I just explained. And my process for these is really just clicking it in by ear and listening to the chords play through so I can get the timing right, and overall making sure all the notes have purpose in the melody. The last bit in the MIDI that I wanted to mention is this random B note that's over here. And I added this in because Analog Labs pads usually have a really big attack to them, so the sound won't really start up till about here. So by adding this in, the render that I rendered out won't cut off right here, it'll have a fade out. So then you can use the blending options in the sampler to kind of fade the end into the beginning so it loops seamlessly. And I'll show that later so you can get a more visual representation of it. So like I just mentioned, I had to render that out because I only have the demo version of Analog Labs, but I did add some effects after that. So I added a portal preset called Flutter Clouds with the mix turned down, and it's also automated, a magic switch, which is a free chorus plugin, a fruity love filter with the cut knob automated, an EQ just to cut all the lows, and then finally an imager just to make it feel really nice and wide. And then here's what it looks like all rendered out with the automation clips, and I did add a channel pitch automation. So how you do that is click here, change the mode to stretch, change the pitch range to 1, and then automate this knob here. And when you're doing this, you really want to click on these notes individually and type in the value as 0.5, just so only the areas that you want detuned are detuned and the rest is completely in tune. And then like I mentioned before with the crossfade, normally if you would render it out and you didn't add that note, it would cut off right here. But because I added that note in, we have all of this extra tail that we can blend into the start of the melody. So I just went ahead and dragged this back so it loops very seamlessly and overall just sounds a lot better. So after all those effects and automation clips, here's what it sounds like. And then for the next sound in the melody, I went back into Analog Labs and grabbed another atmosphere preset, but this one is called Dark Shore. Again, these presets are just super fun to use and really unique sounding. And then for the MIDI for that, it just copies the same MIDI as the first one, but I went ahead and pitched it up an octave so it's a little bit more high pitched. And then again, I had to render that out because I only have the demo version of Analog Labs, but I went ahead and added tape cassette with the wow and flutter turned up, an EQ just to kind of cut out all the frequencies I didn't want to hear, and then finally a pancake on the default preset with the mix turned to 80%. So after all that, I ended up reversing it, and here's what it sounds like with those effects and all rendered out and reversed. Overall, it's just a super simple high accent pattern that fits really well with the first sound. And then for the next sounds in the melody, it's actually two basses that get combined together. So the first one is the jazz bass from Analog Labs, which has become one of my favorite basses recently. And then the second one is the Ample Bass Lite, and this is overall probably the best acoustic bass plugin that you can get that's free. So for the MIDI for the jazz bass, I just have it copying the root notes, of course, but then I added in these chops where it goes up and down octaves just to make it a little bit more interesting. And then for the ample bass, it roughly copies the same bass notes, but then I just added in these little like pluck rolls, and this sounds really good. It makes it super bouncy. I don't really have a method for this, I just kind of click it in by ear, but overall you should definitely try adding acoustic bass on top of a synth bass. It gives a really unique and bouncy sound. So then I ended up rendering out the Analog Lab bass, of course, because I only have the demo, and then here's what it sounds like when you play them together. And then for the effects on those, on the acoustic bass, I just have a low cut and then a boost of like the low mid area. All right, and then for the effects on the synth bass, I have this plugin called Thickify that the guys over at Rocket Powered Sound sent me over. It's a saturation plugin that really just makes your basses and synths feel super wide and a little bit distorted. So it's a really interesting plugin to use. So overall for it, I just turned it up to max on the thickness level, turned the stress up almost all the way, and then turned the drive up about halfway, as well as adjusting the tone. This kind of just gives it a really big and thick feel, which is perfect for these kind of melodies. And right now Thickify is 40% off, so you can check the link in the description if you're interested in getting a saturation plugin. And then just to show you what it does, here's the bass without Thickify. And then with Thickify, it just gets a little louder, grittier, and just bigger in general. So it's a really subtle difference, but it does add a lot to the bass. All right, and then for the next sound in the melody, I went into Keyscape and grabbed the Wing Upright Mono Dark piano. This is probably one of my favorite pianos from Keyscape, along with the 60s Mute and the Dark Indie piano. Overall, just a bunch of solid pianos to use. And then like the previous two MIDIs, it just copies the same exact pattern. I was just trying to get it super layered and full sounding, so this kind of did the job. And then for the effects on that, I have tape cassette with the wow and flutter turned up, a little bit of delay just on the default preset, an EQ to cut out of the mids because it was getting a little bit muddy, an EQ to cut out the lows, and then finally an imager to make it a little bit more mono. I've really been experimenting with actually using imagers, because if you guys remember in a lot of my old tutorials, I would just boost everything so it was super wide. So now I've been actually trying to think about, hey, I want this mono, hey, I want this stereo, so it kind of gives a cooler stereo feeling instead of just blasting everything both to the sides. So after all those effects, here's what it ends up sounding like. Overall, it's just a nice background sound to mesh well with those pads and make it seem a little bit more full. All right, and then for the next sound, I went ahead and grabbed the Wing Upright Dark Indie. Like I just mentioned in the last sound, this is probably my second favorite Keyscape preset. And then for the MIDI, like I do in a lot of my videos and a lot of my melodies, I like to have a sound that accents the clap pattern. So you can see here, it just plays the root note on the clap pattern. And then I don't have it playing here just to give a little bit of variation. And then I have an extra note here, again, just to spice it up a little bit. And then this roll is a roll that I use in a lot of these dark ambient melodies, and like I mentioned when I was explaining the first MIDI, it uses the notes next to each other in the scale to kind of give a nice dark feeling. And then after I had that MIDI finished, I went ahead and ran it through the Mood guitar pedal just to give it a lot of texture and a lot of delay. And then I went ahead and added additional effects, so I added Magic Switch, which is a free chorus plugin, Portal on the Black Hole preset with the mix turned down to 40%, Halftime on the 1 bar preset, a Fruity Reverb with the decay turned up just slightly, an EQ to filter out all the stuff I didn't want to hear and overall make it seem a little bit more old, and then finally a Pancake with the mix turned down to 40%. So after adding those effects and running it through the guitar pedal, here's what it ends up sounding like. Alright, and then for the next sound, I have a synth one-shot called Competence from one of the exotic kits. Overall, it's just a really nice sounding synth, and I kind of used it like a bass. Alright, and then here's the MIDI for it, and like I mentioned, I kind of played it like a bass, so it just copies the bass notes, and then I added in this A for a little bit of variation, and overall to kind of make it a bit more bouncy, because it'll hit, and then the pattern will start over again. Overall, just kind of building a little bit of energy. And then for the effects on that, again, I have Thickify, then I have another EQ to kind of cut out all the stuff I didn't want, and then finally an imager to make it strictly mono. So after those effects and making the MIDI, here's what it ends up sounding like. So then for the last sound of the melody, I actually made my own vocal loop. So I'm going to break down the effects that I used because I don't have the original recordings anymore. But on the main vocal, I just have an EQ, just kind of cleaned it up a bit, a reverb, a chorus, a little altar boy with the formant turned down, and then finally another EQ to do like a telephone effect. On the background vocal, I have that kind of same EQ just to clean it up, a little bit more reverb, a delay turned down about 3/4 of the way, another little altar boy with the formant turned down, and then another EQ just to kind of make it a telephone filter. And then finally for the background vocal, I have that same kind of EQ, but this is more focused on the low end of it. Another little altar boy with the formant turned down, ambience with the size turned pretty much all the way up, thickify, which kind of gave it a thick distorted feel, which was really cool. And then finally an EQ to kind of do a telephone effect on the low end. And then I went ahead and rendered those all together and then added more effects. So I have a compressor just on a leveling preset, portal on the in tongues vocal preset with the mix turned down to 50, shaper box on the texture preset, an EQ to boost the highs, an EQ to cut all the lows, and then finally an EQ to cut more highs. So overall, I think this vocal turned out really good, and eventually I'll have a full tutorial on how to make them, but unfortunately I don't think I'm really good enough yet. But here's what this one sounds like. Alright, so that's pretty much all the melodic things in the melody, but then I did add a bunch of textures, and they're pretty much just a bunch of drum and texture loops that I made that'll be in my upcoming one-shot kit, and I chopped them all up and put them all together, so here's what they sound like. So yeah, those are all the things that went into the melody, and then here's what it sounds like when you combine it all together. Overall, I think this is probably one of my best melodies in this style, so now we can go ahead and get started on the drums. Alright, yeah, so that's going to be pretty much it for the video. Thank you guys for watching. Again, if you're interested in Thickify, the link will be in the description. It'll be 40% off. But overall, I really like the way the drums turned out. I might actually add Thickify on the kick, maybe experiment with that because I haven't used it on drums yet. But overall, pretty happy with the beat. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.